Nick Whalen here from RotoWire. We're talking sneaky waiver wire ads for week 8 of the NFL season. No teams on bye this week, but still plenty of appealing options out there at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. We'll go through all 4 of those positions. We'll give you maybe some players who you're already thinking about, and then we'll get in the mud. We'll give you some players for deeper leagues, maybe some stashes, players to just be aware of at each position as you scan the waiver wire this week. We'll start at the quarterback spot, and a couple obvious names at the top. Sam Darnold of the Minnesota Vikings. He's 45% rostered only on ESPN. A lot of people drop Sam Darnold going into the bye week. Maybe you don't love the matchup against Detroit, but he's still absolutely in starting consideration. Been a top 15 quarterback on the year, even after 2 of his worst fantasy games of the season. Look at the schedule coming up for the Minnesota Vikings. They get the Rams, the Colts, and the Jaguars in their next 3 games. All 3 of those are excellent fantasy spots. All 3 teams are bottom 10 defenses against the pass. The Jags are the worst defense in the NFL against the pass, and the Colts are not too far behind. So double check on Sam Darnold. Obviously, we got to talk Tua Tagovailoa. All indications are that Tua is tracking to return for week 8. Will hopefully breathe some much needed life into that Dolphins passing attack. I'm still approaching this with some degree of caution, but obviously he's a massive upgrade over Tyler Huntley and certainly Tim Boyle, who had to finish out that game against Indy in week 7. The Cardinals, the Bills, the Rams, the Raiders, and the Pats, those are the next 5 opponents for the Miami Dolphins. Some good schedule spots in there. More than anything, though, beyond Tua, this is huge just for Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle. Those guys were the wide receiver 45 and 62, respectively, in per-game production this season. They should see massive upticks with Tua back in the mix. One player we have to address, or one situation really, is the Cleveland Browns. Deshaun Watson confirmed to have a torn Achilles. He's done for the year. Jameis Winston in ESPN leagues is less than 1% rostered. Look, I don't know what the Browns are doing. They seem to be suggesting that Dorian Thompson-Robinson could start now with Watson down for the season, but I don't know if that's going to be the case. I can't imagine, even if they go with DTR, who is injured right now, by the way, he's dealing with a finger injury, could end up missing time. Kevin Stefanski said it's possible he could need surgery. Even if they go to DTR temporarily, I just don't see that lasting very long. I think eventually they turn this thing over to Jameis, and he's going to get a shot. And it's a wildly unappealing offense, limited pass catchers. They just traded Amari Cooper. I get all that. But Jameis came in late in that Cincy game, immediately led a 12-play touchdown drive in just over 2 minutes. He's a significantly better option than Thompson-Robinson. Fantasy upside, it's going to be limited on this team. It's just been such a bad offense so far. There's very few pass catchers you're interested in, but Jameis is somebody you have to consider in super flex leagues. Even so, though, a really tough stretch of defenses coming up for Cleveland. We need to be realistic for expectations for Jameis if he even gets this job in the next week or 2. All right, let's go a little further down the board at quarterback. Drake Maye. We've now seen 2 starts for Drake Maye, one against Houston, one against Jacksonville. He's still less than 15% rostered in ESPN leagues. And we do have to keep in mind, though, he is coming off of what may be his easiest matchup of the entire season. We already mentioned the Jaguars, the number 32 pass defense in the NFL. Maye got off to a good start, led a touchdown drive. The Pats were up in that game 10-0, but you still see some of the rookie pitfalls that are going to come with any first-year quarterback. Either way, he's clearly infused life into this passing game. He's putting up 6.9 yards per attempt. The Pats were at about 5.2 yards per attempt with Jacoby Brissett. Maye's averaging around 260 yards per game through these first 2 starts. And keep in mind, New England, this team's not going to get a whole lot better. They're going to be playing from behind. So even if he's going up against difficult defenses, they have the Jets, the Titans, the Bears, and the Rams in their next 4 games. It might not be good for real life, but again, pass-heavy scripts are coming for the New England Patriots, a team that is very bad in real life, but could be good for us in fantasy. Russell Wilson, another quarterback to consider, 5.2% rostered in ESPN leagues. Keep in mind, I'm not a Russell Wilson guy, but he was the QB 15 last season in Denver. Basically had the same per-game production as players like Trevor Lawrence, Jared Goff. Wasn't all that far behind Patrick Mahomes on a per-game basis last season. He was giving you about 17.5 fantasy points per game. Well, he put up 24.9 fantasy points against the New York Jets in his first start. Steelers get the Giants and the Commanders in their next 2 games. I wouldn't necessarily expect 20 plus from Russ on a weekly basis, but again, if you're looking for QB depth, if you're in a super flex league, Russell Wilson obviously now a viable option. Moving on to running backs, we got a few names to keep an eye on. Jaylen Warren, he saw an increased workload against the Jets, but a decent chunk of that did come late in the game. Keep in mind, Najee Harris still playing really well. He's coming off of 2 of his best games of the season, so no real reason for the Steelers to go away from that. So I don't think Jaylen Warren is really startable right now, but he remains a fairly decent, higher end handcuff. And obviously, if Harris were to miss time, Jaylen Warren is somebody I want on my roster. So somebody to be aware of. Alexander Mattison with the Las Vegas Raiders. Clearly the number one back right now in Vegas, even with Zamir White back this week. And you can make the case that maybe Zamir was just kind of getting back up to speed, but Alexander Mattison outsnapped Zamir White 55-11 against the Rams in week 7. Amir Abdullah mixed in there as well, but mostly on passing downs. We saw Mattison carry the ball 23 times. He was targeted a few times out of the backfield as well. He got all 3 goal line carries for the Las Vegas Raiders. So as bad as this Raiders team may be, they're, for better or for worse, back to Gardner Minshew. If Alexander Mattison continues to see that kind of volume, there's going to be value there. Ray Davis of the Buffalo Bills played only 13 snaps on Sunday against Tennessee, but either carried the ball or was targeted on half of those. He carried 5 times for 41 yards and a touchdown, outproduced James Cook despite the limited workload. Of course, he looked great against the Jets in week 6. This is obviously James Cook's backfield whenever he's healthy, but I think Davis, just over these last couple of weeks, has played well enough that he deserves at least a small share of that workload. And Buffalo's a team that's likely going to be running the ball a lot. They play with leads. There's high touchdown potential in that offense. So if you're looking for a speculative ad, not necessarily somebody you're going to start anytime soon, but somebody who is a high-end insurance policy for James Cook, I don't mind going out and grabbing Ray Davis. As we get a little further down the board at running back, I think Tyler Goodson in Indy, he's somebody you have to keep an eye on. If you're really desperate, hopefully Jonathan Taylor is back this week and we don't have to talk about Tyler Goodson or Trey Sermon ever again. But Goodson did outcarry Sermon 14-8 this past week against Miami. And then, one sneaky ad to keep an eye on, somebody we haven't really talked about since draft season, Kendre Miller in New Orleans played 20 snaps on Thursday night against Denver. Obviously, that was a bizarre game, a ridiculous game script. The Saints couldn't really do anything, but I thought Kendre Miller looked decent. 6 carries for 36 yards, was targeted 3 times by Spencer Rattler. Just someone to monitor if this Saints season continues to spiral. I don't think they'll trade Alvin Kamara, but not totally out of the realm of possibility. And if they do, all of a sudden, Kendre Miller is looking like the RB1. Either way, if this season does fully get away from New Orleans, they could try to get an extended look at Kendre Miller at some point this season. So if you're in a deep league, if you have room on your roster for a speculative ad, I think there's some upside with Kendre Miller. Before we talk wide receivers, please give this video a like if you're enjoying it and make sure you're subscribed to the RotoWire YouTube channel. We're going to keep bringing you tons of content each week through the rest of the NFL season. Just hit that little subscribe button right there. All right, it's time to talk wide receivers, and we'll start with an obvious name, somebody that I feel like Jeff and I have talked about every week in this video, but Romeo Doubs needs to be rostered in just about every league. Maybe you're not starting him, but he absolutely needs to be rostered. Once again, this past week against Houston, Romeo Doubs led the Packers in snaps, he led the Packers in routes, and he led the Packers in targets with 10. I thought he made some really impressive, difficult catches, some clutch catches late in that game. Romeo Doubs is somebody who Jordan Love absolutely trusts, and certainly somebody who the Packers coaching staff trusts. And whatever was happening with him 2 or 3 weeks ago, that seems to be in the past. Packers get a great matchup, the best matchup in football this coming week against the Jacksonville Jaguars. That is a startable spot for Romeo Doubs. Although, again, with no teams on bye, you're probably not in a desperation situation, save for injuries. After that, the Packers get the Lions, the Bears, and the 49ers. Those are going to be competitive games where Green Bay is going to have to throw the ball a decent amount. And it's worth noting, by the way, that Dontavian Wicks, the darling of the waiver wire a couple weeks ago, only played 24 snaps on Sunday against Houston. So he's looking like the wide receiver 4 right now in that deep Packers rotation. Romeo Doubs, if he's out there in your league, double check, go grab him. We got big news out of San Francisco this weekend. Another loss for the 49ers. Deebo Samuel missed almost that entire game due to an illness. But far bigger than that is that Brandon Ayuk has a torn ACL and is done for the season. So Juwan Jennings, who himself did not play against the Chiefs in week 7, he should be set for a much bigger role going forward. You know about Juwan Jennings. We don't have to tell you that. But if you're looking deeper down the depth chart in San Francisco, rookie Ricky Pearsall led the Niners in snaps and routes last week. Again, that was essentially without Deebo, without Juwan Jennings, and then with Ayuk leaving that game. But nonetheless, he was targeted 5 times on 32 routes. Chris Conley, veteran receiver, he played 44 snaps, did earn just 2 targets. Not super excited by him. I think the Hail Mary play in this Niners offense might be Jacob Cowing, who played only 12 snaps, but was targeted 3 times on 8 routes run and a big catch late in that game that looked like at the time it was going to set the Niners up for a score. But Ricky Pearsall would be the guy I'm targeting in San Francisco. But man, this Niners team just ravaged by injuries this season. So if you can't get Juwan Jennings, take a look at Ricky Pearsall. Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns, another player we need to discuss. Jerry Jeudy led the Browns in snaps and routes by a good margin this past week, but he was only targeted 6 times. Obviously, this is a woefully inefficient passing offense. Tillman was targeted 12 times on 47 routes. He was out there for almost all the 11 personnel snaps. That's a very good sign as far as his role going forward. And he caught 8 of those 12 targets for 81 yards. Again, really tough to project the Browns offense right now, especially if it's Dorian Thompson-Robinson. At that point, I'm probably not all that interested in Tillman. But if and when we get Jameis Winston at some point, that should be enough of a boost for this offense that I at least have some interest in Cedric Tillman. And who knows, maybe Jameis Winston can salvage Jerry Jeudy. He's still going to be the guy that's leading in terms of snaps and routes, but productivity-wise, Tillman was somebody who at least flashed a little bit this past week. Jalen Nailor of the Minnesota Vikings, he's played well over 90% of snaps in 11 personnel over the last 2 games. So that's with Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison healthy. He played 39 of 40 snaps in 11 this past week. Clearly now the number 3 guy in Minnesota, and this is looking like one of the best offenses in football. Not necessarily somebody you need to roster right now because of the caliber of receivers ahead of him. They're getting TJ Hawkinson back soon. But if Addison or Jefferson were to miss any time, Nailor would immediately become fantasy relevant. So he's somebody I'm monitoring. In deeper leagues, you got to keep an eye on the Raiders. Tre Tucker, DJ Turner, they were the 2 leaders at receiver for Vegas, with Jacoby Myers out again this past week. Now, once Myers is back, he's really the only Raiders receiver that I would comfortably roster. But if he misses any more time, or if he goes down again later in the year, I wouldn't mind rolling the dice on Turner or Tucker. Could be worth it. They'll be on the field at the very least. They both played 75 snaps last week. Both were targeted 7 times by Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew. And then in terms of other deep league options, we have to keep looking at the Saints. Again, really unappealing offense right now. That was one of the worst offensive performances I've ever seen on Thursday night against Denver. But Bub Means, Mason Tipton, they're going to be in the mix. Means was the guy in week 6. Tipton was more so the guy in terms of the volume in week 7. Chris Olave still in concussion protocol to begin the week. Obviously, if he's back, both Means and Tipton lose some appeal. But if Chris Olave does miss another game, there's at least some value for Means and Tipton. And keep in mind, the Saints do get a matchup with Carolina in a couple of weeks. So you would like to think Olave is back for that. But in the event that he's not, Bub Means, Mason Tipton, could be some desperation plays over at receiver. We'll finish out at tight end. Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots, and should probably mention, some of those receiving options as well. Kayshon Boutte in New England. He was more so the guy in that London game against Jacksonville. But honestly, if there's one guy in the New England pass catching core that I want, it's Hunter Henry. And he's still available in about 75% of ESPN leagues. He's drawn 14 targets over the last 2 games with Drake Maye, including 9 this past week. He's the tight end 5 in total PPR points so far this season. So there's a disconnect there between how viable is the Patriots offense versus how viable is Hunter Henry. Again, if I had to roster one Patriots pass catcher, it would be Hunter Henry. The wide receiver core is kind of a mess right now in terms of sorting out the target distribution. They've had some injuries there as well. I think Hunter Henry is going to be the most consistent option, and I think Drake Maye is going to continue to look his way. A couple other tight ends to keep an eye on. Noah Fant, only rostered in about 7.7% of ESPN leagues. He's put up 10 catches for 128 yards over the last 2 games. It's going to be a pass-heavy offense in Seattle. Fant has not found the end zone yet, but eventually that's got to come, and could see a slight boost if DK Metcalf misses some time. Seattle calling him week to week coming out of that win over Atlanta. Jonnu Smith in Miami, less than 2% rostered in ESPN leagues. He's drawn 15 targets over the last 2 weeks. He has 12 catches for 158 yards, caught a touchdown this past week against the Colts. Now, everything in that offense changes with Tua, but I still think Smith is worth a flyer if you need tight end help. He's been targeted on 27% of his routes over these last couple of games. Last but not least, Taysom Hill. Some people love Taysom Hill. Some people hate Taysom Hill. He has not played since week 4, but should be back in the next week or two from that rib injury. He had 2 touchdowns in week 4 against Atlanta before getting hurt in that game. Love him or hate him, he always finds a way to make an impact for this team. Despite only playing 2.5 games, he's carried the ball 14 times already on the season. The Saints are going to be scratching and clawing for any sort of offense. I think Taysom Hill walks back into that Swiss Army knife role as soon as he's available. And again, 2 weeks from now, the Saints play the Carolina Panthers. So if I'm struggling at tight end, if I feel like I'm just spinning the wheel each week and trying a different option, I don't mind putting Taysom Hill in the mix, specifically for that Carolina game. He should be available in plenty of leagues with all the carnage at tight end. All right, those are sneaky ads to consider ahead of week 8 of the NFL season. Let us know who you're adding. Do we miss anybody obvious? Any receivers, any running backs, any tight ends you're going out to grab on the waiver wire? Make sure you let us know in the comments below. Please make sure you're subscribed to the RotoWire YouTube channel. You can find all of our podcasts on Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well. Really appreciate all the support here on YouTube. And while you're here, go check out rotowire.com/try, TRY. That'll get you full access to everything on our site, all of our tools, all of our rankings, our projections, our articles, rotowire.com/try.